Hey everybody, I have another update for you on Michelangelo's brain and the creation of Adam. This particular video, though, I want to touch on something that I think is really important, and it's the topic of pareidolia. And this is not going to be my main video that I'm going to upload fairly soon when I get the energy to really dig deep into the whole pareidolia thing and show everybody that it's pseudoscience. It's not real. It cannot be used scientifically to determine anything, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe in extreme cases, but generally no. What pareidolia has actually become is a buzzword to describe anything that may seem a little bit out of the ordinary. But there's no tests or gauges, or there's nothing defined, there's no test data, there's no test set that decides whether or not something becomes meaningful or not. That's the whole problem with pareidolia. The whole thing you always see, when no matter what you read about it, the first sentence is people seeing something that is insignificant and meaningless or random. Those are all subjective terms. No one can decide what meaningless is. That is an opinion. No one can decide what random is, because there are things in the universe that are ordered. There are things that people have done, Michelangelo, for example, that are ordered. But the bottom line is we have this particular article here by these two doctors, and this video in a way is kind of a message to them. I know they'll never listen to it probably, but just in case they do, I'm using this to make an example out of this whole pareidolia failure. Okay. So this article was created in 2009. You can find it on PubMed, and you can also find it right here. It's called Pareidolia, Diagnostic Clues apropos of Visual Illusions. The two doctors here, which I'm not going to attempt to butcher their names, we have Dr. Vincent, and then I'm not going to butcher this one, but they're both PhD, Department of Neurology. Okay, so in this particular article, they reference a Dr. Meshberger, and it says this. Meshberger wrote on his neuroanatomical interpretation of the Michelangelo's oil creation of Adam by comparing the image of God wrapped in a swirling cloak surrounded by cherubims depicted at the right side of the picture to a brain sagittal view. He probably provided the pareidolia example with the greatest repercussion in modern medical history. It says that, or modern medical literature, in a pure pareidolia attempt, convinced that the left-handed master from Florence purposely included anatomical message in his pieces, two Brazilian authors wrote a book on putative interpretations of Michelangelo's paintings, details his organs, bones, joints, and a series of other aspects of the human anatomy. So now we have these guys telling each other that they have pareidolia. But this is all opinion. Defending this guy, for example, though, let's take a look at what they did. You can find this diagram on PubMed if you look for it. This is the diagram many of you are probably familiar with. And the defense of the person who wrote this article that I'm about to show that he didn't know what he was talking about as far as pareidolia goes, and this is a prime example of it. In his defense, when we take a look at this, this is what I guess Meshberger drew, and this is what we see in the PubMed article anyway. And you can see that the brain is a diagram, number one, and it is a it is not to proportion what we see there. When we talk about the metaphysical, and the metaphysical, I know you may cringe at the word of metaphysical, but think of it this way. If you were trying to decide to give somebody the difference between, say, two similar-looking clouds in the sky, you would never be able to do that with words. Words could never do that. And even math, if you were going to try to use math to describe something very complex and similar looking to something else, you wouldn't be able to do it when it comes to appearance. The metaphysical means that words just do not suffice. And so the only way you would be able to do it is with an image. The problem here is that this image is very poor. The proper way to have done this would be to have taken a real sagittal brain or a professional diagram of one and used it as your guide in order to see if Michelangelo had actually done this or not. The second problem with this is that the brain is turned the wrong way. The only way you would know this is if you've actually done research into the ancient cultures, the various philosophies and hermetics and things like this. One of the reasons that the two doctors there believe that the whole brain idea is pareidolia is because they haven't researched enough to understand that all of these ancient cultures referred to what was called the divine mind. Divine mind is another name for Christ. It's another name for the firstborn out of the infinite, or the only begotten. It has many different names, but it refers to a different structure of how God unfolds, or reality unfolds, whatever you want to call it, from a chain of events starting in the invisible and then moving its way into the physical universe and so on. That's what this whole thing represents. And in Kabbalah, which many people believe that Michelangelo was a Kabbalist, because of the paintings in the Sistine Chapel, it would have made perfect sense that he would actually have painted a brain, because he would have understood the divine mind. He would have understood what's called the Ancient of Days. And when we read about the Ancient of Days, or when we read about that in Kabbalah, we always find that it is mentioned in right profile. And therefore, if he had had this information, he would have probably put the brain on there correctly. But his intuition was correct in the sense that it was a brain. So, back to the doctor again, who said that he's experiencing pareidolia. This is a diagram I'm going to use, and I have labeled the Michelangelo painting now. It's my latest update, and you will see that it goes into very high detail regarding all of these areas in the brain that you're looking at right here, most all of these. Some of them are kind of insignificant, and he didn't put them on there. But the purpose of this video is to show you that he actually did paint a brain, and I'm going to be able to show you the labeling and what he's done in high detail all over the image. And when we're done with all this, the purpose is this. Pareidolia is completely misused. And so once I prove this neurologist has used it incorrectly, then I hope he goes and apologizes to Meshberger. And I hope that he learns that in the future there are some things that really need to be done about pareidolia. This whole idea of saying that something has meaning or not. That these types of things must be defined. And they cannot be subjective, or it's a bias test and doesn't pass the scientific method. You can't decide that something is random or not. And so when you put yourself in the whole real life or real world situation, you can't determine whether or not something may have meaning or not. The only person that can determine that is the person who is seeing it, and there may be past history associated with it. There may be something that maybe he knows that you don't know. You know, autostereograms. People have the ability to be able to see things in those. And of course, the argument back is that, well, we know it is a stereogram. Well, just because you know something doesn't. Just because you are not able to see something, for example, in nature or what have you, does not necessarily mean that it doesn't exist and that you're seeing something if you can't see it. So that you can see that this is a very subjective kind of thing. Let's take a look at Michelangelo's painting here real quick, and I've got some diagrams that you can take a look at, and we're going to follow it closely. I'm going to just go around the brain real quick and show you the detail. Okay, so those of you who have seen these videos before are probably familiar with this latest drawing, or this latest one I did, where I superimposed this brain on top of the creation of Adam. The purpose of this video, though, is to show you all the details. So we're going to get into the detail like the pineal gland, the fornix, all these areas in the center of the brain, which we've really shown a lot of detail. And we're also going to see some other areas. But we're going to attack it from the very largest and move our way into the middle. That's the way that we're going to do it. Now, rather than just freehanding a brain on top of the painting, Michelangelo was an anatomist. He understood. He was a very accurate artist. I mean, we have to give him credit for his accuracy on the human body. Just about everybody knows this. So why would it be any different on the brain than it would be on any other part of the body? He would have done it to extreme accuracy. So right here is a Gray's Anatomy version of the brain. In my image, what you're going to see is this brain, but it's going to be flipped right profile. And then I have taken all of these labels off simply because they are it's not a good quality for one, but I've used another one I just showed you a second ago, which is all going to label the same thing. The purpose of using Gray's Anatomy brain that we see here is for the accuracy of the geometry. What you find is when you begin looking at the brain, you look at all these little folds in the brain and these regions, and you find that all of the geometry is always very close. It may not always be exact, but it's going to be very close most of the time. And that's what we're going to see in Michelangelo's painting. So here is the painting again with the brain superimposed on top of it and the labels. Now, the reason I've got the brain mostly transparent like that is because I want to be able to see what's going on in the background, all of the people and everything, because Michelangelo accounted for this. He used people, he used their body language and so forth in order to express the image of the brain. He was brilliant. I mean, that's all there is to it. So we're going to go around the brain here real quick and just take a look. If we take a look at the whole package of the brain, one of the things that you're going to notice right here is you're going to notice that these two areas right here, this is where the occipital lobe and the cerebellum split, these two areas of the brain. And so another thing that I did on this particular image is, if you'll notice her arms, all I did was I took off the part of the corpus callosum, and all I did was I colored her arms in place of it, because the corpus callosum ran along her arms like this and through her shoulders, and so I thought it would be a better thing to show you would be just to color her arms instead, to show that her arms are actually representing the corpus callosum. So let's take a look at some of these. God's head and his chest area and his arm make up the parietal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. You'll see this area up here in his chest, and if you'll notice, there's these little dark lines that you see in between the folds of the brain, and you'll notice that his arm, where his elbow bends, and this white area of the brain that you see right here that travels along his arm, that's called the cingulate gyrus, which he accounted for. These little guys up here are also accounted for in the top area of the frontal lobe that comes around. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the corpus callosum that I just showed you, and that is her arms. It comes around right here through her shoulders and back to the other side again. And you can see that her arms follow the same curvature that we see on his arm, with the elbow right behind her head. So his arm is actually the cingulate gyrus, and her arms is actually the corpus callosum. And if you take a look at all the nearest neighbors, you'll find that all the geometry is correct. Now, the next thing I want to take a look at, and it's going to require this original image, because I want to show you what Michelangelo did here. We're going to take a look at the fornix. The fornix is this guy right here, but I want to show you what Michelangelo accounted for, because we have the fornix and then we have what's called the choroid plexus. Now, the difference between the two is this red area that you see right here above the thalamus. That is the choroid plexus, and this thing that you see right above this little red beaded looking thing, that's the fornix. Notice how the red thing stops before the fornix does? The fornix continues around the thalamus. Well, now let's take a look at Michelangelo's original painting. And what you'll notice here is that he's got this area right here shaded. And you see this area that sticks out a little bit? That is the choroid plexus. And this area coming all the way around is the fornix. That's the kind of detail that we're talking about here. Now, just to show you that, we've got the brain that's superimposed on top of that. So where this arrow is pointing to right here is the choroid plexus, and you'll notice that where the thalamus is located, right under it, you'll notice that the choroid plexus stops in the same position as it does right here. It stops right above the area that is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. Okay. So he's used the shading in that area to account for, and you'll notice the geometry is perfect on both of these guys. Okay. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the occipital lobe, and that's basically what I was pointing out earlier. That's this area right here, the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe comes down into a point. Just like we see on any brain, we're always going to see the occipital lobe, and there's a split in between the two. So when you look at Michelangelo's painting and you see this area right here, that's the same as what you're looking at right here. And you can see the way that this comes into it here is doing the same thing as the curvature of the cerebellum. So when we take a look at our diagram, we can see that the occipital lobe follows the exact same angle that we see on his drawing or his painting. And you can see that the cerebellum fits right in there as it should. This arbor vitae is right here, and if you take a look at his painting, you'll see that that area right here is this area in the middle of this boy's head right here. If you look at the overall structure of that, you can see it's the same as the cerebellum. So you can see the cerebellum is supposed to fit in there just like that. All his geometry, all the nearest neighbors are correct. Okay, now let's take a look at some more detail. If we take a look at Michelangelo's painting, we'll notice that on his robe up here he has these folds. We've already seen the fornix, we've seen the choroid plexus right here, and now we have this other interesting fold right here. And this area is referring to the pineal gland. Well, we know this because when we take a look, we can see where the thalamus is located. And this is right behind the thalamus, and that's where the pineal gland is located. So that would be the pineal gland. He's also, in the shading of his clothes, if you notice, the shading of his clothes is covering the areas of the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. And so this next one I think is amazing because if you take a look, let's take a look at this picture right here. This corpora quadrigemina, it comes here and it splits into two. You see these two green areas and how there's split right in between the two of them? Okay, well, let's take a look at Michelangelo's original painting. And you see what he's done right here with the split? He's done the same thing here as what you see right here. And right above it, we see the pineal gland, just like we would expect. Remember, these are flipped in opposite directions. Okay, this is flipped. This is on the left side. But he's accounting for these things in the folds. So let's take a look at the diagram now. So here is the geometry and location of the corpora quadrigemina, and if you notice, the split is right there where the fold is. He's accounted for all of this geometry in very high detail. Okay, so we've already done the arbor vitae at the cerebellum. We've already covered the cingulate gyrus, and we've covered the intermediate mass of the thalamus, which is located right here. And you'll notice all the geometry is sound. The frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, it comes around, but if you notice, these kids, notice how he has his arm reached out? And if you look at this shaded line, these shaded lines follow the pathway of his arm. And if you take a look at this green area back here, it follows the same as what we see with the frontal lobe. The hypothalamus is this area that you see. If you take a look at this structure right here, I'll show you the similarity here. See the area in purple? That area in purple would be the same area that we see right in here. And we know it's the hypothalamus because you see where the pituitary gland is? This red sac right here? That's the pituitary. What he's accounted for with the pituitary in the same geometry of where it's supposed to be is the kneecap. The kneecap is actually the pituitary. It's the correct size and the correct distance from what we see as the hypothalamus. It's right in the location it should be. Another thing too is that you can gauge it because if you take a look at the whole width of the brain right here, the pituitary is always located right in the center and at the bottom of it. Let me show you. So here's the whole length of the brain right here, and you can see the pituitary is located right there. So the geometry, once again, is correct. He's put the pituitary right there, the whole length of the brain. And as you can see, coming out of the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is this area right down here he's accounted for. We have the pons up here, and we have the medulla oblongata. And if you notice, he's kind of got a separation between this boy's shoulder and the clothing. And if we take a look at the geometry, we see that the medulla oblongata comes up and then it hits the pons, and that's kind of what we got going on right here. And this area that you see here would be the medulla oblongata coming down. So there's all the detail, folks, all the way down to small things like the corpora quadrigemina. It's a hard word for me to remember for some reason. And you can see that her arms, I think that's pretty cool too, the way that she's done her arms in order to mimic the... But this is so much detail that my point is this. We have a doctor that wants to label something as pareidolia. We have another doctor that wanted to represent the brain but did no high detail of it at all. So he set himself up basically for to be ridiculed or what have you because he didn't do it in detail. But the question is how much detail do you guys need in order for you to decide something is not pareidolia? The problem is that there are many other factors and variables that go into this. There is the history. There is what's actually the mood or the scene. What goes along with it. Not everybody's a mainstream Christian. A lot of people understand the esoteric ideas of philosophy and other forms of religions, and so the divine mind is a perfect example of what many religions would have actually painted. And this goes all the way back to Plato. And as you can see, the geometry of the brain and all its nearest neighbors are perfect. And so I believe I'm probably the first one to show a diagram like this. But it's important for me because I want to show everybody that even neurologists incorrectly use this term pareidolia all the time for people. And I think that it needs to stop. Either you need to adjust your testing or something like that, because in the end, what this is really all about, guys, is it's about you not seeing that somebody is not fitting into your worldview, and so they're seeing things. You know, if you can't make those decisions like that. I mean, in very extreme cases you can, but you can't just whip out pareidolia, you know, at the drop of a hat. And what should have happened here is you should have actually looked at this in high detail. And I would think that with 3 neurologists or 4 neurologists, which is the total, we had 2 that wrote about Michelangelo, we had 2 that are ridiculing him, and none of you guys have looked at this in detail to make a decision. Clearly it's not pareidolia. What's happened here is that people just don't look into things deeply. So anyways, that's my point. Pareidolia is ridiculous, and I sure hope that something is done about it, so that that we don't end up, ignoring things that we should be paying attention to in the future. You guys take care. I'll talk to you soon.